Are you happy with your career? Are your team members? Turns out there's more to being happy in your job than loving your boss and having flexible hours. And when we're unhappy at work, it's likely due to more than these obvious reasons. It is time to investigate what's really going on so we can help ourselves and our team members love their careers. Today's guest is Dr. Tessa West. Tessa is a professor of psychology at New York University, where she is a leading expert on the science of social relationships. Her academic research and writing for the media focuses on how to improve communication between employees, bosses, and hiring professionals across workplace settings. She has over 100 academic publications and is a regular contributor to the Wall Street Journal. Her first book, Jerks at Work, published to rave reviews, and her latest book, Job Therapy, is what we discussed today. Now, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. I share new episodes and tips for managers every week. Now, here's the conversation. Thank you so much for joining me today, Tessa. We're going to talk about some really fun stuff, which is why people get unhappy in their jobs and their careers, which is like not the opposite of what I talk about on the show. We're really here to talk about like how do you stop people from feeling that way. So I know you have a lot of wonderful insights to share from your research and your work. So thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me on the show.
All right. Why don't you start by giving us a little bit of the lay of the land? Because we've all probably heard that people are unhappy with their boss, or they're unhappy kind of post-pandemic with the return to office, or the kind of structural changes. But that's not the only reason why people find themselves a little unhappy in their jobs. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, I actually think most of us are unhappy, around 80%, and we really don't know why. So if you were to ask people, why are you unhappy at work? They actually tend to lean on these structural things that you mentioned. I don't like my compensation package, or I'm unhappy with my job title. But most of us are actually unhappy for kind of deeper psychological reasons that we haven't really thought too deeply about. And some of the same reasons why we fall out of love from a romantic relationship, or we feel underappreciated, or we start having an identity crisis, these tend to be the actual kind of triggers of unhappiness in the workplace as well. It just takes a lot of kind of digging to kind of figure out exactly what is it about this job that I don't like. So I think most of us are really struggling with that question of, why am I unhappy here?
So if we're so unhappy and we're so unaware, what do we do with that? Like, it feels like we're kind of just stuck in this cycle, or this kind of place of going through motions, but not really knowing how to kind of step out of that. So what do you recommend we do to just start getting ourselves a little more aware, or like diving into like what's really going on here so that we can start to take the right steps?
Job therapy is all about actually giving you those tools. I think most of us have no idea where to start. I mean, even if you're miserable in a relationship, you can kind of look over at the person and think, oh, I don't like the way you chew, or you're starting to annoy me. And we don't really know what the issue is. So in job therapy, each chapter is kind of structured around different starting places. And I actually just give you a quiz you can take that will help you kind of diagnose whether this particular problem is really relevant to you. And I think, taking these little tests and then taking them repeatedly over time to look at consistency in your feelings is really important. And I'd also say one of the main reasons why a lot of us wind up in these kinds of the chapters that I talk about, these places, is because we're very bad at anticipating our stressors at work and seeing how they have downstream consequences on our mental health, but also our workplace behaviors. And the opening chapter of my book actually just asks you to start there. Predict what you think will stress you out at the beginning of the day, and then document what actually does, and look at those discrepancies and measure them over time. And you'll start to see some patterns of, oh, maybe that commute is more stressful than I realized, because half the time it runs over by 30 minutes or something like that. And so collecting little pieces of data on yourself is really important to diagnosing the problem.
Well, and it sounds like that there's some parts of this kind of being unhappy at work that might be localized to this particular job I'm in now, right? It's this particular colleague who's always stressing me out or frustrating to work with. It's this particular commute that is just, I'm ready to, it's, making me really unhappy. I'm coming home and being really grumpy with my partner or my children. It's right, some particular set of tasks that have fallen onto your shoulders. Is there a version of this that is not about this particular job, but maybe about like this stage in my life, or the direction I'm heading or where I see my path going? Or are there other things that are leading us to be so unhappy?
Yeah, there's definitely these kinds of deep existential issues. I think most of us aren't trained to think that way about our unhappiness. We look for kind of local explanations, but often we have complex emotions. And so you mentioned things about like having an identity crisis at work, experiencing ennui, or feeling shame at work, or being on an emotional roller coaster, super ambivalent. You love it one moment, you hate it the next. And these are common emotional experiences people have, but we haven't really been taught how to talk about them because we don't think of our careers as like a relationship partner. We think of it as something that we do, not something we're in a relationship with. And so there's not really room for processing that messiness that you just talked about. And so we're experiencing it. We wake up in the middle of the night and think, do I really want to do this with the rest of my life? And then we say, yes, you do, because you spent $200,000 on college loans to get here. End of conversation with the self. Get dressed, go to work, and stop whining about it. And I think that that's like a common kind of pattern that people find themselves in.
That's such a good analogy to relationships, and also like that thought process of like, I've already done this. And I will say for myself, like I love my podcast, and every once in a while I'm like, do I really want to do another episode? Like, just sometimes you have those days where like, do I really want to do this? And then I go, I already have 200 and some episodes. I already have 300 and some episodes. Of course I'm going to do another one. I'm not throwing that away. And like, it's a process to get comfortable with the fact that sometimes the choices you made in the past were the right choices then, but maybe are no longer the right choices, or that you need to shift. And I'm definitely going to keep doing this podcast. So anyone who's listening who's like, wait a second, you might not do this. I'm definitely going to keep doing this podcast. I deeply love it. But like everyone, sometimes we have our moments. But I want to bring it back to this idea of the relationship with your career, because I've never heard it framed that way. And I think it's such an interesting way to think about almost that like you are not your career, right? Like when you think about like your relationship with your partner, right? You have a relationship with them, you are not them. But I feel like with a career, we are so tied up in like, I am a blank, right? This is what I do. And therefore, this is who I am. I don't even know where to ask a question about this, but I'm just like talking out loud because this is such an interesting way to think about it. So take it where you want to go from there.
This idea that we are highly identified with our careers. And, I think we've been misled a little bit because there's this zeitgeist of purpose-driven work, right? We should all be doing this purpose-driven work. And what that really means is you do work that is so meaningful to you, it's actually starting to define you. And that could be great for some people. You really want to fit. You want an industry that, is the same amount of purpose-driven or identity-driven work that what you're willing to kind of give in. But I think a lot of us actually end up in this very dangerous quadrant I talk about in my book, which is you're highly identified with the career, but that identity satisfaction is low. So you can be addicted to your job and kind of hate it at the same time. And that is, a really dangerous place to be. You can also be like not at all identified with your job, but feel satisfied with it. Like, yeah, it's fine. I don't mind my job, but it doesn't define me. And you just really don't want to end up in that place where something owns you, where if you do poorly at work, it makes you feel bad about yourself for the whole day. But also if you do really well, it makes you feel really good about yourself for the whole day. And everyone in your life suffers or benefits from that enmeshment you have with your career. And the moment you become unsatisfied, the career just makes you mostly feel bad. It's like an abusive relationship. And those are very hard to get out of because we end up in these patterns of intermittent reinforcement. The job benefits you, it gives back to you, but not in a scheduled way, not in a predictable way. And because we're on that roller coaster, we find ourselves going all in and becoming hyper engaged with our job in an effort to resolve that cognitive dissonance we're feeling of like, I love it and I hate it. I love it and I hate it. Well, I'm just going to go all in and I'm going to prove to this job that I can give it everything. And that is actually a red flag that you're having an identity crisis at work. It is not a signal. Bosses, if you're listening to this, if you see employees do this, it's a red flag. That doesn't mean that they're actually in love with their job. It means they're trying to prove to themselves that they are. And that's a very different thing. And so those emotions, that kind of yuckiness around identity, I think is something that a lot of people are experiencing right now.
What are some of those other positions people might be in? And then what are the red flags we should be looking out for as bosses?
Some of the major red flags that I think bosses aren't trained to look for are things like, are people asking during performance management conversations, during feedback conversations, are they asking tough, uncomfortable questions that are creating friction in the relationship, but are absolutely essential for building intimacy with the career. And by that, I mean, questions like, I'm having a really hard time prioritizing my roles here. I feel like I'm spread too thin, and I feel like you and I are in a dynamic where you ask me to do a lot and I say yes to it, and it's not actually helping me get ahead. I want to break out of that so I can have a healthier career. Instead, what people are doing is saying, yeah, I'll take on more. Yeah, I'll do all that stuff. Those should actually be red flags. You want to see people who exercise some restraint, who have those boundaries, and who are willing to create a little friction in their relationship with you in an effort to solve problems when they first pop up and to create kind of long-term fit for a job. But I think a lot of us are trained to look for comfortable interactions, smooth interactions, interactions that feel effortless. And a lot of that just comes down to nodding my head and smiling and going, yeah, that sounds great. Oh, that's so great. I'll totally do all that stuff you just brought up. When in reality, that should be a huge red flag for bosses. So I think, people who are willing to kind of go all in and not prioritize and say yes to everything is a big red flag. These early signs of engagement can also be a little bit of a red flag for people. And then I also think another kind of red flag we often don't think about is the nature and the function of people's social networks at work. To the extent you've been working for a long time, you tend to have what are called deep, strong network connections. So you have a couple of really close friends at work, but they're not broad. And so people are not actually doing things like learning the curriculum, learning how to get ahead, figuring out who to go to for help. And bosses are often very unaware of what people's social networks even look like. I mean, as a boss, it would be tough if you gave me a piece of paper and wrote down all my direct reports and said, draw bubbles of who they're connected to and how close those connections are. I would have a hard time doing that. But the strength of those connections and being connected to the right people is a huge predictor of the success of the people who report to you. So we're often not even trained to look for those particular things. We just kind of narrow in on the behavior of the individual in isolation. So lots out there that bosses could be doing to kind of dig into these things, and also to have more honest interviews that are frictiony, but in a good way, to kind of look to make sure that the alignment is there.
Are there ways that we can start to understand those dynamics and those relationships, especially if we have a remote team or a team that is only co-located part of the time, and it may not be as so obvious as like, oh, those people go to lunch together, so I can just, write that down and note that they left at the same time to go get lunch?
I think what you want to do is actually sit down with the people that you work with and say, okay, let's talk about who you're networking with, and be really concrete with what are those relationships like. The things you can ask are, who do you go to for help? You even know who to go to for help. But let's look at the list of names you came up with. Are these actual people who have any kinds of knowledge in this area? Who do you go to for career advice? And you actually want the people who report to you to have up and adjacent network connections. So by that, I mean people who are at the level of their manager, but are friends with or colleagues with their manager, not two levels up, but at the manager and wider. The more, kinds of conversations they can have with adjacent managers, the more information they can get about the lay of the land. And then I would also ask them about their knowledge of the hidden curriculum. And you can use phrases like, how are you learning how things are done here? And what do you think some of the norms are of the workplace? What do you think some of the things that you think are going to get you ahead, but no one's talking about? Ask them explicitly, what are some of the beliefs you're having around these things? What I found in my work is one of the main reasons why people struggle to get ahead is because they have pluralistic ignorance around how much helping behavior is going on at work. I'm taking on a whole bunch of stuff for other people, and I think everyone else here is too, but they're actually not. There's huge pluralistic ignorance around that particular phenomenon, but you got to pull out of people, like, what are you doing that you think is helping you get ahead? And then say, okay, that's actually not helping you get ahead. You're taking on these roles that are not actually helping you. So pulling out of them the things that they have these lay beliefs around, and who, in their intuition, they should be connected with, but maybe aren't, and I think just in helping them form those connections explicitly. I think remote work has created a lot of invisible labor. It's created invisible social networks. And you really just have to shine a light on those things in a very explicit way if you're a boss or manager, if you want to get a handle on what's going on.
The virtual component of work has just made everything so much more complicated, which means you just have to be so much more intentional about fostering whatever it is, connections, communication. I'm wondering, what do you do if you discover or you have an inkling that someone is actually very unhappy? right? And maybe it's, because you actually have one of these conversations with them and they kind of let you know that they have like no social network, or maybe they come to you and they're like, I really can't handle this. Like I'm spread too thin. I don't know what to do. What do we do with that? How do we help? Or, can we even help people kind of find a better place in this role? Or do we need to be like, the higher self and say, okay, maybe this isn't the right place for you anymore. And I'll help you find the next thing for you. Like, I want you to be happy. And if this can't be here, I'll help you find somewhere else.
Yeah, I do think that we rarely have those explicit conversations. So I'd say, managers can be job therapists in a sense if they can actually help diagnose these problems with the tools in this book and, giving people those quizzes. The first step is to get at the sense of why they think they're struggling versus why you think they're struggling, closing that information gap. And often the answers are different. They'll say things like, I'm really struggling to get ahead here because no one respects me at work, or, the work I'm doing just doesn't seem to be on anyone's radar. And then you find out that they're taking on roles that are what we call low status tasks, things anyone could be doing that are in fact kind of leading them astray. And so just closing that information gap is like 90% of the work. Why do you think you're struggling? Tell me what you're doing. Now I'm going to weigh in and tell you why I think you're potentially struggling here. And then coming up with a plan that involves networking them with people, that involves things like knowledge transfer, and then having them go through a simple exercise of asking people in different teams to finish the question, before I started this job, nobody told me that. And so they can learn the hidden curriculum at work. I think there's a lot of we assume someone's miserable. It's time to kind of help get them out without diagnosing how much of this we actually have control over. And then if you are to actually kind of help them find something new, you can help them go through this process of what we call grave dressing in close relationships, which is describing, why the relationship failed, what you could be doing differently the next time, and what you need to fill in the gaps for. So kind of walking them through kind of all those stages of a relationship breakup. But I do think most managers, by the time they get someone unhappy, they think they're a lost cause. They think they're disengaged. But a lot of it is just coming down to they're doing things to get ahead that are not helping them get ahead. And they're operating under a set of misconceptions that you can clarify and kind of clear up.
That makes a lot of sense. And another one that I hear from my clients is, their team members really want promotions. And they're like, either we just don't have any positions that we can't promote everybody, or they're like, well, they're missing these critical skills. And so we're like working with them, but like it takes time and they don't want to be patient. And is it kind of a similar approach when someone is unhappy because they're not progressing? Or are there different steps we want to take with folks who are finding themselves in that position?
Yeah, I think, I have a chapter called The Runner Up, and I also have an underappreciated star chapter. This is a common thing. I think I love that you talked about sort of these demands for promotions that don't exist. Promotion pipeline data is a black box. We are rarely told things like how many promotions are actually available, how many competitive people are applying for them, what is the average length of time in a current position before I'm competitive, or who am I even being compared to? I think most people actually have no clue who the comparison others are. All they know is who got the job. They don't know who's in the top 10, what their resumes look like, whether those people had roles 10 roles ago that they didn't. And so just kind of explaining to people what the promotion pipeline looks like and giving them some access to that data will really help explain this. I think, one thing I found a lot from managers is this common complaint of they all want to be promoted, but there are no promotions. Well, that's because you don't have a little, hierarchy up in your office that says 4 people a year for this thing, 10 people a year for this thing. And then among those 4, we get about 2,000 competitive applicants, not just applicants, because who cares about the numbers? Everyone applies for everything. Competitive applicants, right? And on average, it takes 10 times before you get that thing. I recently talked to someone who was promoted after his 4th attempt, and he was ready to give up. He felt like such a loser. Once he was promoted, he became a member of the promotion committee and learned that the average was 8. So he was actually doing really well, but no one had told him any of this stuff. No clue. And he was ready to quit. So we really just have to be super explicit about promotion pipeline data and numbers and comparison to others and all of that business to make people feel like they're not being ignored. They're not in this perpetual runner-up place.
That's such a great story. I wonder if you have other stories for either from yourself or from your clients that kind of show us what happens when real people are kind of in the mix of this.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I interviewed a bunch of people for job therapy who all had really complex feelings. One person I spoke with, who I perceived as in the early stages of an identity crisis at work, demonstrated a pattern of behavior which is really common. And he talked about actually how much he loved his job. In fact, in the opening chapter, he pretty much says, "You're interviewing me for the wrong chapter. I'm not having an identity crisis. This isn't me." And then he would sort of talk about how much he loves his job, but then kind of, pivot a little to fantasizing about other careers, and then kind of correct himself and say things like, "Yeah, I might get a PhD, or I might move to another state to become an educator." He works in tech, but like that's for like a hobby down the road. I promise I'm really in this job, and this kind of ambivalence, this back and forth thing, I think is really common for people. People have a lot of these mixed emotions at work. I think this is something we see a lot. I'd also, want to highlight that feelings of guilt and sunk costs are super common among people who are career transitioning. A lot of the people I talked to felt like they were letting down their families. It was going to cost a lot of extra money. And that reason was enough for them to not explore something new. And once they started having those conversations with their families were much more understanding and supportive than they had anticipated. So I often think we kind of just need to break the seal a little bit on that. And I've talked to a lot of people who have kind of jumped on board with the honest interview approach after just looking too much for comfortable interviews that had a good fit, that felt, warm and friendly, and just realizing this is a terrible strategy. So some of the people I interviewed who are sort of experts in the interviewing process have figured out how to sample the skills of the job in the actual interview in often really creative ways. This one man, Dan Heisman, I talked to, he worked for a firm where you had to go into C-suites and train them on a skill. And he didn't care what the skill was, but he made people come in and teach them something. So one guy taught how to make sushi. One guy taught them how to play drums. And the whole exercise wasn't just how good you are at teaching, but how good you are at feedback following that exercise. So the team would then say, like, when you made sushi, I didn't really get that. And what they were looking for was defensiveness. And that was really what they were sampling in the job interview. So there's kinds of all these kind of clever things you can do. So I've learned lots of little hacks of, what people's experiences are that were often kind of things that we're not talking about at work.
Oh my gosh, I love those. And I want to just go back to your comment about like the friends and family support, because I feel like I had that reaction. My husband decided to leave his career as an artist after 15 years and showing all over the country. And he told me that he wasn't going to be an artist anymore. And I was so sad. I could not believe, like, I can't believe you're like not going to do this thing. Like, he has a graduate degree in this. He's been showing all over the country. Like, this was his identity. Like, I felt like I was losing something when he said he was no longer going to be this, have this career. And so I can only imagine and what it's like for people who have friends or family who have been part of their journey, and how hard it is to say to them, right? So even if when you get to that place where it's right for you, to be able to turn to your partner and say, I'm leaving this career, right? To your parents who were supporting of you to say, I'm leaving this career, to your friends in that community who you're now no longer going to be networking with in the same way because you're not in the same industry or the same thing, right? Like that can just feels like very heavy. And so I just wanted to kind of lift that up for a second.
There's a mourning process when you leave your career, and you need to think about it in the same way that if you have to tell your kids you're getting a divorce, like, we understand the brevity of that. We understand the desire to frame up the leaving, to justify it, to over explain it. But because it's a job, that's something that we do and we don't have a relationship with, we aren't trained to kind of anticipate how hard it's going to be. And then that the difficulty scares people and they back away from it and say, I'm actually not ready for this. This must be a sign that I shouldn't leave, when this is just a normal part of the exit process.
Before we end on this very sad, depressing note of everyone leaving their careers, let's talk about like the flip side of that, where maybe you go through the assessment that you talked about in the beginning and you kind of talked with your boss and kind of figured some things out. Is there a settling that can happen when you have decided okay, now this is what I'm going to do, or this is how things are going to change so that I am now in a good place and a good relationship with my career and the job that I'm in now? Do you have any stories about what that looks like?
It's a click, right? It's a chemistry thing. Once they find that place, they get there, I think the main thing that you want to do is make sure that that career is given back to you consistently in the same way. So my friend Trish, who's in the book, she, left school psychology to become a therapist. And it was like a weight had been lifted off of her, even though she was still doing that kind of low level stressful stuff of managing children and starting a new career and having a boss who was 20 years younger than her and all of that stuff. But what she didn't feel is that like surge of like her blood pressure going up, her cortisol spiking the moment she got in her car going to work. And I think just feeling like she finally found her match, so to speak, it made kind of those low level stressors turn from moments of threat to moments of challenge. And what she started noticing was changes in her physical health. She could sleep better. Her eating kind of got more regular. She was more motivated to exercise. And so all that stuff that had fallen off because her body was so stressed out started to kind of come back. And so what you'll start to see when you find that fit is it's not just that you're enjoying your work. It's that you sleep better at night. It's that you are more motivated to eat healthy. It's that you're drinking one less glass of wine and you're snapping at your children a little bit less. And so those are kinds of the wonderful things that happen to you once you find that match. But I think what's really important is this isn't just about you giving more and more and more until you find something. It's about something that's giving back to you in the ways that you're willing to give to it. And you actually need there to be a balance. And the same way that a romantic relationship can't work if just one person's engaging in all the effort, that career needs to be giving to you in the same ways, that you value, that you're willing to give to it. So just keep track of that and make sure that you're not putting way too much in to keep this relationship alive, and look out for those little kind of inner physical changes in yourself.
Yes. And don't we all want to sleep better and be nicer with our families? So sounds dreamy. Okay. Wrapping us up here, Tessa, tell me about a great manager that you worked for and what made this person such a fabulous boss.
So when I was in graduate school, I worked with this person, Jack DeVideo, and he was a fabulous boss because he uncovered the hidden curriculum for me on day one. He told me things like, people are going to ask you to do the following roles. Don't do any of them. They won't help you, get ahead in your career, and they're going to guilt you. You're still going to say no. He explained to me what the promotion pipeline looked like. So he was an editor at a journal. He was a provost at one point. He was in all those sausage making meetings where he knew how stuff was done. And he was perfectly comfortable with being super transparent about what it actually takes to get ahead in this career versus what Twitter's going to tell you. And just constantly reminding me over and over again, don't follow that advice. Don't listen to that. That is misleading. That is not actually what helps you get ahead. And he also convinced me, there are no life hacks to getting ahead. It's showing up, it's working hard, it's having these blunt conversations over and over again. And, you can't kind of productivity your way into success without doing those things. And for his transparency, he's taught me how to be a mentor. So that to me was kind of the best boss I've ever had.
Oh my gosh, what a gift to have that on day one. I can imagine the big difference it made in your future. And everyone who's listening, do that with your new hires.
Yep.
All right. And where can people learn more about you, get a copy of your book and all that jazz?
Yeah. So you can go to tessawestauthor.com. I actually have my career quiz on there. You can get immediate feedback, and all the other quizzes from my book, Jerks at Work, are also on there. And you can go to tessawestlab.com if you want to learn about my research. You can buy my book wherever books are sold. It's on Amazon, major bookstores, and so forth.
Your latest book is Job Therapy.
Job Therapy. Yep.
Awesome. Well, thank you again for joining me today. Such a pleasure to talk with you.
Thank you so much.